They said my great-granddaddy Joe was a medical marvel, a survivor, a fighter with a lust for life. But the truth? The truth was much darker than anyone dared to admit. He didn't survive because he was strong, he survived because he made a deal with death. When I was a kid, he loved telling me that story, pulling me in close with his rough, trembling hands, his voice like gravel scraping at the walls of my nightmares. "Did I ever tell you about the time I cheated death, Thomas?" He'd ask, eyes gleaming in the dim light. And though I had heard it countless times before, I'd always shake my head playing along, eager for the familiar chill to creep up my spine. "I was barely out of short trousers when I signed up for the army," he'd begin. Nothing out of the ordinary about that. Boys were dying like flies in that first Great War. Some of them, barely 15, lied about their age, thinking they'd be heroes. But there's no glory in war, just blood and screaming. He'd lean in closer then, his breath thick with the stench of old tobacco and something else. Something sour, like decayed flowers. We were stationed near the Ain River, and things were bad, really bad. Amid the chaos, I saw him, a young fella, no older than 16 or 17. But there was something wrong about him. He wasn't scared, not like the rest of us. He moved through the battlefield like smoke, drifting between the living and the dead. And when he touched someone, they dropped. Just like that. Like their life was snuffed out with a flick of his fingers. Granddaddy's voice would drop to a whisper then, the air in the room growing colder. At first, I thought he was just a kid, some soldier gone mad. But he wasn't like us. He wasn't human. He'd appear in the smoke, vanish, then reappear somewhere else, always calm, always watching. And then there he was, right next to me. Granddaddy's eyes would go dark as he recounted that moment, as if reliving the terror. I'd never been so scared, but I was cocky back then, thought I had nothing to lose. So before he could lay his hand on me, I said, "I hear you like a gamble. How about a coin toss? Best of 3. Heads I live. Tails you take me." His lips would twitch into a grim smile. Death looked at me, his eyes black as coal, and nodded. His voice. God, his voice. It was beautiful, too beautiful, like it didn't belong to something so dark. "That's against the rules, you know," he said. But he agreed anyway. Heads I live, tails I die. I could almost hear the trembling coin in my great-granddaddy's voice. "What Death didn't know," he'd say, "was that my coin, my lucky coin, was rigged, two-headed. I tossed it, and both times it came up heads." Death just stared at me for a moment, like he knew, like he saw right through me. But then he smiled, an angelic smile that didn't reach those empty, dead eyes, and said, "You win. I'll pass you by." And just like that, he was gone, vanished back into the smoke. Granddaddy would always laugh then, a brittle sound that echoed too long in the silence. I saw him again after that, many times. He walked through the trenches, touching others, claiming them, but he never touched me. He'd just watch me from the corner of his eye, never saying a word. And the smell, I'll never forget that smell. It was like baby's breath and something sour, like cat piss. Death always smells like that, you know. Every time he told the story, that smell would change, sometimes roses, sometimes something far worse. But no matter how many times I heard it, one thing stayed the same. The cold, creeping certainty that death wasn't done with great-granddaddy Joe. The smell of death had always shifted. Sometimes it was cherries, sometimes rotting skunks, mint, or the stench of horseshit. Never consistent, always unsettling. I don't think my Grandpa Joe ever really wanted to remember what death smelled like during the war. Not in detail, anyway. In 1961, Grandpa Joe was in his early 60s when he had a brutal car accident. A lorry sideswiped him, sending his car flipping over and over until it crashed into a ditch. He lost a leg and an eye that day. The doctors couldn't believe he'd survived. They called it a medical miracle. But Grandpa Joe confided something else in me, his voice barely above a whisper. He was convinced that the young man driving the ambulance that day was the same figure he'd seen years ago in the trenches. "I swear, Thomas," he'd say, his words rattling in my bones, "that accident was meant to kill me. But here I am, still standing. Seems like that deal I made all those years ago wasn't a one-time thing. Death was in that ambulance, but he didn't touch me." I never truly believed him. As a kid, I thought he'd made up the story to scare me, to entertain me. But when he told me about the car crash, there was something different in his voice, a coldness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It unsettled him, even if I didn't fully understand why. Then, in 1983, Grandpa Joe was diagnosed with cancer. I was 13 at the time, too young to understand the weight of it, but I knew enough to be afraid. I thought of those stories he'd told me about the deal with death, and I prayed they were true. I hoped death would pass him by once again, and he did. After months of suffering, Grandpa Joe went into remission. But something had changed in him. There was a haunted look in his eyes, like he had glimpsed something in the shadows and couldn't shake it. He never talked much about his recovery, but one day, when his health had taken another turn for the worse, he muttered something that made my skin crawl. "What if it never comes for me?" he asked, voice trembling. I didn't know what to say. By then, he was in his mid-80s, a frail shell of the man he used to be. Half blind, unable to walk, but still alive. Always alive. He was terrified that the thing he'd cheated for so long had forgotten him. By 1996, when he was in his late 90s, his cancer had returned. The doctors told us there was nothing more they could do. He was hooked up to machines, waiting for the inevitable. Except it didn't feel inevitable. Not with Grandpa Joe. His mind was still sharp, even though his body had all but given up. One day, I visited him, and I could tell something was gnawing at him. At first, I thought he needed more pain meds, but he insisted that wasn't it. After a long pause, he finally told me what was on his mind. "Get my coin," he said, his voice weak but urgent. "The one I used back then. Maybe if I show him again. Maybe death will take me this time." I didn't know how to react, but I went home and tore through his things, searching for the old shoebox where he kept it. My mom found me knee-deep in Grandpa's old junk. When I told her what I was looking for, she sighed. "I threw it out," she said casually. "Your granddad's such a hoarder." I thought it was just some old junk. I didn't know what to think, whether I believed the stories or not, but I knew Grandpa Joe did. When I returned to the hospital empty-handed, he was asleep, the machines around him humming softly. I felt a strange relief wash over me, knowing I wouldn't have to tell him the coin was gone. I sank into the chair next to him, exhaustion pulling at me. It wasn't long before I started to doze off. In the haze between waking and dreaming, I heard the door creak open. A young doctor entered the room, his footsteps unnervingly soft. As he passed me, he whispered in a voice that was velvet smooth, "You should sleep. You need it." I tried to shake myself awake, but I couldn't. It was like something heavy was pressing down on me, and though my mind screamed to move, my body sank deeper into the chair. It felt pleasant, too pleasant. And as I slipped further into the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if Grandpa Joe's time had finally run out, or if mine had. For the first time in days, I felt warm, peaceful, like a heavy weight had been lifted from my chest. Though I slept, I could still hear voices in the room, clear as a bell. "You know I cheated that day," Grandpa Joe's voice said softly, a faint tremor in his words. A low chuckle followed, smooth and soothing, but it carried an eerie familiarity. "No need to worry about that, Joe," the voice responded, calm and almost gentle. Of course I knew, but it didn't matter. I can't break the rules, just as I never made them. It wasn't your time, that's all. I just thought playing along might bring you some comfort in such a macabre moment. After all, you were barely more than a child. A chill crept down my spine as I lay there, paralyzed in sleep, but somehow still listening. The voice continued, soft yet tinged with humor. The car crash. The cancer. Grandpa Joe's voice faltered, weaker now, more fragile. It just wasn't your time again, Joe. I felt something shift inside me. A deep sense of happiness, like a smile spreading across my soul. It was the feeling of my mother's kitchen on Christmas morning. The smell of cookies baking. The warmth of my dog curled up at my feet on a cold night. That soothing voice spoke again, almost wistful now. "I'm a deeply misunderstood figure, you know," it said, a rueful tone hiding an amused undertone. "I don't murder people, Joe. There's enough hate and disease in the world without my help. All I do is stop the suffering. Can you imagine what it would be like if I didn't?" Suddenly, the scent of the ocean washed over me, salty air mingling with the memory of a hot summer's day. I could smell my girlfriend, fresh out of the shower, that clean, familiar scent that brought me comfort. And then Grandpa Joe's voice, barely a whisper now. "Yes, that's what I've been afraid of." The voice asked one last question, tender but final. "So, are you ready?" "Yes," Grandpa Joe answered, a calm acceptance in his tone. "I'm ready." When Grandpa Joe flatlined, the room seemed to shift. The hum of machines continued, but there was no panic. A rush of medical staff flooded in, but no one attempted to resuscitate him. It was his wish. His face was calm, serene, almost as if he were still sleeping. So it turns out, Grandpa Joe was wrong after all. When death comes for you, it doesn't smell of decay, or fear, or even baby's breath and cat piss. No. Death smells like comfort.